This is the last video on the Power and the People course, and we will be looking at minority rights and race relations in Britain after the Second World War. To start with, we need to understand the situation in Britain in 1945. So Britain has just won the Second World War, but thousands of homes and buildings had been destroyed by the German bombing raids, and hundreds of thousands of men had died in the fighting. So Britain needed to rebuild the country and address the labour shortage after the war. To fix this, the government passed the British Nationality Act of 1948. This act offers citizenship to anyone from the British Empire, which meant that people from across the British Empire and the Commonwealth were legally entitled to live and work in Britain. Now, the British Isles has had immigration for thousands of years, but since 1945, it has changed in its scale and the destinations people were from. The first generation to come came from the Caribbean, and in 1948, the ship HMT Empire Windrush arrived in Britain, carrying nearly 500 migrants from the West Indies. Over the next 2 decades, hundreds of thousands of people from the Caribbean came to Britain seeking a better life. They became known as the Windrush generation. The Windrush generation contributed to rebuilding post-war Britain, working in public services such as public transport, postal services, and the newly created NHS. Many left their home to escape economic hardship and received 4 to 5 times higher wages in Britain. Many expected that after a few years of hard work, they would return home with a bit of money, but most stayed and soon formed communities in major cities like Birmingham, Manchester, or London. A quick side note, just want to note that this wasn't just immigrants from the Caribbean, and there were also hundreds of thousands of more people coming to Britain from countries in Asia and Africa. This immigration was spread across many decades, but there were certain world events which triggered larger inflows of people to Britain. For example, in the horror and aftermath of the partition of India, violence and displacement led Indians and Pakistanis to seek new lives abroad. By 1951, there were over 40,000 South Asians living in the country. In the 1960s, the unrest caused by the Nigerian Civil War and economic hardship in Ghana led tens of thousands of West Africans to move to the UK. Finally, in 1972, the slightly tyrannical leader of Uganda, Idi Amin, declared the expulsion of all Indians from Uganda. He gave Indians in Africa 90 days to leave the country, or they would be imprisoned in a military camp. 27,000 Ugandan Asians were resettled in Britain, having to rebuild their lives. I myself am British Indian, and one set of my grandparents came to the country in the early 1960s and the other in the 1970s, partly as a result of what happened in Uganda. Anyway, by 1965, there were almost 1 million immigrants living in Britain. But at the time, it was not against the law to treat people differently based on the colour of their skin. For example, housing adverts often stated this message: and banks wouldn't give them mortgages, so people had to rent the worst houses to often the highest prices. Some industries had a colour bar, which meant that they would not give you jobs if you were not white British. The conditions in England did not seem to match up to what these immigrants expected before they arrived to the country. 3 Race Relations Acts were passed in 1965, 1968 and 1976, which aimed to prevent discrimination in Britain on the basis of race. To make matters more difficult, tensions often grew in working class areas where jobs and housing was scarce. In 1958, there were race riots in Nottingham and in London against black communities, and far-right political groups such as the White Defence League or the National Front called for people of colour to be sent back to their home countries and for immigration to be stopped. In 1968, the Conservative MP for Wolverhampton, Enoch Powell, made his anti-immigration Rivers of Blood speech, predicting a breakdown in society if immigration continued. He was sacked from the Conservative Party, but he gained much support from the British public. Now we're going to look at a case study of race relations in Britain with the Brixton Riots of 1981. So to give you some context, Brixton is an area of South London, and about a third of Brixton's population was of Caribbean descent. In 1981, the area suffered from high unemployment, poor housing, and strained relations with the police. A large amount of police were deployed in the area, and they would use stop and search tactics to stop anyone and search them if they thought they might be planning to commit a crime. However, in practice, young black people were 7 to 8 more likely to be stopped than white suspects, and many felt they were being disproportionately targeted because of their race. It was not just black communities, but also many white communities in Brixton had a poor relationship with the police there. In April 1981, the police launched Operation Swamp 81, an intensive stop and search campaign to reduce crime. Then a few days later, on the 10th of April, an incident occurred in which a police officer was trying to help a young black man who had been stabbed and was bleeding to death. There were rumours that the officer tried to arrest him and his mistreatment contributed to his death. Although this was not actually the case, it does demonstrate the distrust that the local community had in the police. Over the next few days, huge crowds gathered and massive riots took place against the police. Police sent in over 1,000 more officers to Brixton, who used baton charges and formed shield walls to retain order. In all, 300 police officers were injured, 100 vehicles destroyed, and 150 buildings burned, damaged, or looted during the Brixton riots. The government published the Scarman Report in November 1981, which was meant to investigate the causes of the Brixton riots and how to address racial tension and policing problems. The report found that the riots had real social causes rather than just simply criminal behaviour. For example, high youth unemployment rates, poor housing, and racial discrimination all contributed to what happened. It also placed blame on the police, saying that they were too eager to target young black men with their stop and search powers and poor community relations. The government didn't really accept the report, and few of its recommendations on tackling social deprivation were actually implemented. That's the end of this course, but I'd rather end on a slightly more positive note, as although Britain has certainly had challenges with race relations, it has also made real progress. Today, Britain is one of the most diverse and multicultural countries in the world, and people from many backgrounds have contributed to every part of British life, from politics and education to culture and sport. But the story isn't over, and we should never get complacent about improving society for everyone. Hopefully, by learning about history, it can give you the tools to learn from our past and work for positive change in the future. Thanks for watching.